This weekend we had 3 weddings here at Christ the King. And I presume that about 6 weeks or so before, everyone received an invitation in the mail. And it would tell them the date, the place, and the time. Now the time is always a little relative, depending on when the bride and her party show up. Although at last night's wedding, at 5:30, we didn't have one usher present, kind of a reverse. In the 40 or so years that I've been performing marriages, the worst case was an hour and 45 minutes late. The guests were really upset. I stayed somewhat calm, thinking that I was going to have to deal for the first time with somebody who had been left at the altar. But she finally showed up, and we found out that she was sewing beads on her dress. About a year later, she had twins. And I said to her, "Now look, I waited for you for the wedding. I am not waiting for you at the baptism." And she was early. The custom in the time of Jesus wasn't getting an invitation in the mail. A general invitation would be announced. You know, my son is getting married in the spring, and we'll let you know when everything is ready. And that's the parable that Jesus uses today, that a king was throwing a wedding feast for his son. And he had told them in general when it would be, but then finally when all the preparations were done, he sent his servants out and said, "Tell them to come to the feast." Some ignored them, some went home, and some even killed the messengers. Then the owner says, "Well, go out and invite everybody in. Everybody, the good and the bad. Go out to all the street corners and invite them in." And scripture scholars would tell us that this really is a story about the kingdom, or the feast that will take place in the kingdom. And at first, the invitations were limited to the chosen people, but they ignored the message. They killed the prophets, and they didn't come into the feast. So then God says, well, invite everybody. Everybody is invited to the feast. Matthew's gospel then adds a postscript. Some would say it's a separate parable about the man who came to the feast, who was invited, but didn't have a proper wedding garment. It would be as if you showed up here for a wedding in shorts and a tank top. It just doesn't really go. But it seems unfair because the man was just grabbed off the street to come to the feast. And scholars would tell us that it's simply a story. It's a story to say that even though everyone is invited, there is some responsibility of the one who is invited to, quote, dress properly. It's an image of being dressed by the decisions that we make, the choices that we make, the lives that we lead. The real question for you and me this morning is, are we dressed appropriately? It's like standing in front of a mirror and not seeing our clothing, but more seeing a history of our life and what we have done and what we are doing to prepare for the feast. Have our good actions perhaps faded with time? Do we kid ourselves about something that we did years ago being sufficient for the decades that have taken place since? Every now and then it's time to update our spiritual wardrobe with an examination, an honest examination of our conscience, an examination of how we are living our lives. Sometimes we have clothes in a closet that you're never going to wear again. I have a theory that closet air shrinks clothing, but that's a topic for another reflection sometime. But we do need to see how things have just faded away sometimes. And we need to refurbish the clothing. The Gospel of Matthew tells a story how we are loved and cared for and valued by God, that we are all called to come to the feast. Are we all dressed properly?